Good morning. I feel like a runner at the starting line. I'm so eager to get going to share that I kind of catch my breath and have to hold myself back with this anticipation of being able to move forward with you. So it's a delight for me to look and to see you on the screen, to share with you this morning Psalm 25. Psalm 25 is 22 verses and structurally has a couple of elements that are part of the message, as the medium is the message. It's the first of the acrostics. There will be 9 psalms that are, if you will, A to Z. This is the first of those. And part of the message of doing Aleph, Bet, Gimel, going through the alphabet, is part of that is, one moment, did I lose you?
You're fine, Rabbi.
I'm okay, but I have to get you back on my screen. There you are. So part of that, A to Z, is to convey comprehend, so that things are inclusive. I'm trying to say and include all of who I am, being wholly aware, in this case, of my failings. So the acrostic is a quality of being fully disclosed before God. As one of the commentators pointed out, to do that was all the more remarkable in an ancient time where they didn't have thesauruses or dictionaries. So the poet had to, in the moment, find an aleph and a bet. So one element of this psalm is that quality of acrostic. Another poetic term is chiastic. Chiastic is a repeating of patterns. In this case, the pattern is A, B, C, B, A. Let me explain. Verses 1 to 7, and you can put this up, Eric. Verses 1 to 7 focus on speaking to God. So 1 to 7 is A. Verses 8 to 10 are about God. That's in the third person. Verse 11, which is kind of the central point of this verse, is C. It's back to 2. For the sake of your name, Adonai, forgive my wrongdoing, for it is great. So it's talking directly to God. But then 12 to 15 shift back to being about God in the third person. And then verses 16 to 21-22 are back to 2. So it's chiastic. There's this pattern of going back and forth between talking to God and about God. One thing that I'll point out, and then I'll read it and then we'll analyze, but I just reread it this morning in anticipation of sharing and did some tweaking. I mentioned before we started that even within the last 20 minutes, I sent Eric a new version of this translation, just with tweaks, but every word counts, which is to say there's always the possibility of continuing to tweak. So 2 words. One is, as I continue to immerse myself in Psalms, every week I get a new book or 2 of Psalms that I become aware of as translations or commentaries. And in doing so, some of them are beautiful. There's a wonderful teacher in the Reform movement who died recently. His name is Richard Levy, truly one of the stars, one of the greats of the contemporary Jewish community, who translated all 150 Psalms, and he did Psalm 25 acrostically in English. If we had a lot more time, I would read you his translation, which is to say there's a lot of different approaches to what it is you'd want to convey in a translation. What I've sought to do in my translations is to hone it pretty close to the Hebrew, because I am fascinated by the weave in the Hebrew itself and want to highlight that. And the exception being in the English, I try to make God genderless, and if I can, the speaker genderless, so that it can ring more broad-based in our own contemporary ear. So let me read the psalm, and then I'll highlight some of the choices of translation and some of the key message. As I noted in the letter of introduction to this psalm, there are two distinctive elements not found in other psalms. The emphasis on shame, a word that will be repeated 4 times, both for himself and his enemies. Let me not be ashamed. Let my enemies be ashamed. So this concept of busha, that's one thing that's distinctive. And the other thing that's distinctive is in verse 7, the errors of his youth. The emphasis of, the estrays of the youth and how they impact on his later life. All right, let me now share with you Psalm 25, which I have retitled, Let Me Not Be Ashamed. For David, to you, Adonai, I lift up my soul. Okay, I'm going to pause because I already see a change I'm going to make. And I won't do this, I hope, again. But the word nafshi, this was pointed out by Rabbi Podwal when we were looking at Psalm 23. The word nefesh is spirit, it's breath, it's life. In that sense, it's a lower level of soul. Soul is also identified with consciousness, awareness, that which survives our existence. So I've just made a change. Here's an example of how I go about translating. To you, Adonai, I lift up my spirit, which means I lift up my life, rather than the word soul. All right, I'm going to start over, and I will send you, Eric, that change. I begin again. For David, to you, Adonai, I lift up my spirit. My God, in you I have trusted. Let me not be ashamed. Let my enemies not triumph over me. Indeed, let none that hope in you be ashamed. Let them be ashamed who deal treacherously over triviality. Your ways, Adonai, let me know them intimately. Your paths, teach me. Guide me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my deliverance. For you I have hoped each day. Remember your mercies, Adonai, and your kindness, for from eternity are they. Estrays of my youth and my crimes do not remember. As is your kindness, remember me, you, for the sake of your goodness, Adonai. Good and upright is Adonai, therefore instruct the astray of the way. Guide the humble of the law and teach the humble God's way. All the paths of Adonai are mercy and truth for the keepers of God's covenant and testimonies. For the sake of your name, Adonai, forgive my wrongdoing, for it is great. Who is the person with awe of Adonai? Instruct in the way that such a person should choose. Their soul and goodness shall abide, and their seed shall inherit land. The secret of Adonai is for the awestruck, and God's covenant is made intimately known to them. My eyes are always toward Adonai, for God extracts my feet from the net. Turn your face toward me and be gracious to me, for alone and afflicted am I. The stresses of my heart are expanded, for my straits extract me. See my affliction and my burdens, and lift up all my stray acts. Look at my enemies, for they are many, and the violent hatred with which they hate me. Guard my spirit and save me. Let me not be ashamed, for I have taken refuge in you. Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, because I have hoped in you. Redeem, O God, Israel from all distresses. So, some thoughts about translation and themes that are carried on here. One, I just really picked up on this in preparing this morning, and I delight in noting it for myself. And that is one of the places that I have often been drawn when traveling are cemeteries. Cemeteries are, and the epitaphs in cemeteries, a window into a place and its culture. And in looking at cemeteries and Jewish cemeteries in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Hasidic community, the epitaph that I noted that is particularly common is Tom Vayosher, which is verse 21. Let integrity and uprightness, and then the rest of that verse, preserve me, because I have hoped in you. And I always thought that Tom Vayashar, and again in the epitaphs, it's without punctuation, was kind of this Hasidic motif of humility and straightness, directness, and it is, and that is a value. And we've talked about it in looking at other Psalms where of the four sons at Pesach, in a Hasidic popular commentary, the simple son, the Tam, is considered to be the most extolled because he's humble. He's simple in the sense of not looking to be flashy, but unadorned, or if you will, of integrity, that the inside and the outside match. And yashar means straight, not devious. But seeing it here in this context, there's an added sense of its meaning and value. If you've passed, you would want to say, God, let integrity and uprightness preserve me. Preserve me meaning eternally, because I have hoped in you. And seeing it here in this context just adds to my sense of the value. But look interestingly at verse 8. God is referred to as Tov V'Yashar, not Tam, but Tov. Tov is good. So God is good and upright, while a human being is Tam V'Yashar. Again, Tam being simple, or if you will, being of integrity, the inside and the outside matching. So I like this. They almost sound alike, Tov V'Yashar, Tam V'Yashar, that in some ways we reflect God, but we are not God. God's goodness, God's Tov, is unfiltered and on some level pure, like light. Ours is compromised. At best, what we can do is seek to have a quality of integrity, but it's always incomplete. And so to the psalm, some things to point out are, first of all, the envelope. I've become drawn to the envelopes. And here, Benjamin Siegel in his literary analysis is always helpful to me. But if you look at verses 1 to 3 and then 19 to 21, you have a repetition of key words. Nafshi, my spirit. Ovai, my enemies. Kovecha, I hope. And Avosh or Yevosh, shame. This, again, motif of let me not be ashamed, let my enemies be ashamed, is at the beginning and at the end, the acknowledgement that there are enemies. And now the question, if this is an acrostic, how is it that there's two letters missing? Here are the two letters that are missing. Now, some people, there's potentially three letters missing. You see, verse 1 has Elecha Adonai, that's the Aleph, to you, Adonai. Verse 2 begins Elohai, my God, that's also an aleph. But the next two words are a bet. Bicha batachti. In you I have trusted. So most commentators would see the bet of the acrostic as the two words and the repetition of the bet in verse 2. But having said that, here are the two letters that are missing. The vav, which would be between verses 5 and 6. There is no vav, and there is no kuf, which would be after the tuf, pei ayin kuf, pei ayin kuf. There is no kuf. And those two letters, kuf and vav, are the root of the word hope, kaveh. The word kaveh, the word hope, that is part of that envelope. Again, it's in verses 3, it's in verse 5 and verse 21. This ultimately is a psalm of hope, kaveh. That's the Hebrew word for hope. And remarkably, the two key consonants of kaveh, two of the three, are the two that are missing in this acrostic. So these psalms are so tightly woven, one must assume that nothing is accidental, and that the kaveh, as the two letters, the kuf and the vav, are perhaps either to convey that this is a psalm of hope, and that, if you will, is implicit in all of it. That's one possibility. And therefore, because it's so immediately present, it doesn't need to be explicit. Or it's to say something paradoxical. And that is, I am hoping for you, but in a state of humility and not taking it for granted. So I dare not declare my hope as if it's a tightly put together package. This package of an acrostic precisely on this key motif of hope is lacking, meaning it depends on you responding for it to be complete. So again, I think that's part of the artistry of it. Here's some other things to note about the artistry and this key motif of humility. See, in verse 9, you get the word twice, humble. Guide the humble in the law. Teach the humble God's way. Anavim, both times, both words. Verses 5 to 9 have the same motif repeated over and over, which is about paths and looking to learn from God. See, in this case, the Psalter is acknowledging verse 7, estrays of my youth and my crimes do not remember. As is your kindness, remember me, you, for the sake of your goodness, Adonai. So the Psalter feels ashamed, and we're not told what these crimes are, but something he did in his youth and perhaps persisted in his adulthood brings him to God with embarrassment. Note that I choose to translate in verse 7 and elsewhere, chatoot, which is often translated as sins, estrays, in that a high holiday type teaching is that the word chet in Hebrew is also an archery term for when you miss the target, the arrow that goes astray. And in that regard, in contrast to the Christian concept of sin that taints, that stains, and we get that also in biblical and rabbinic, but less so, here it's what goes astray can be realigned. But to realign it, we need God to be our guide. Hadricheni va'amitcha v'lamdeni, verse 5. Guide me in your truth and teach me. here too, I've chosen to translate in my retranslating verse 4, the verse before it, Dirachecha, your ways, Adonai, hodi eni, let me know them intimately. The word for Adam being physically intimate with Eve is the word yada. So in Hebrew, this word lamdeni implies something intimate, an intimate way of knowing in relationship. The last line, verse 22, is, as we've seen in other Psalms, kind of set apart from the rest of the Psalm. In some cases, it's a punchline. In other cases, commentators, in this case, Robert Alter, would say it's just kind of a standard closing because it's a shift. This is a deeply personal psalm, a psalm of asking God in God's beneficence to forgive the Psalter for the indiscretions of his youth and the wrongs of his adulthood out of God's goodness, not for his sake, but for God's sake. And verse 22 has this shift where it's about Israel. Redeem, O God, Israel from all distresses. Now, we did have the word distress appear earlier in the psalm, which might indicate continuity. And classical commentators, the medieval Jewish commentators, would say that after one prays for oneself, one then shifts and feels the gratitude for belonging to Israel and prays on behalf of the community. And so that gives the context why before concluding these words before God, there's, not only redeem me, but now that I've spoken from my heart about my need to be forgiven, please also redeem all of Israel from all distresses. So that's possible. It again shifts here to the collective and either is possible as to why there is that shift here at the end. With that, we have some time now for your reactions to Psalm 25. What touched you in hearing this psalm? And I can only identify if I see a hand. I can see, I think, most of you. I don't see any hands yet, so I can keep adding some things. My teacher, Rabbi Podwal.
Just, I love your beautiful explanation of the two missing letters in the acrostic is hope. And as you know, 2 Psalms from now, the conclusion of Psalm 27 is all hope. It's Kaveh el Adonai, Chazak b'Yamasibecha, v'Kaveh el Adonai.
Yeah.
Psalm 27.
So I'm glad you're foreshadowing next week's study in terms of Psalm 27. That's the psalm that we recite every morning for a month in preparation for the new year. So all throughout the month of Elul, before Rosh Hashanah, we will be reading Psalm 27. We'll be looking at that on Tuesday next week with the question of why the rabbis chose this of the 150 Psalms to be read every day. And as Rabbi Podwal points out, one of the answers is the key theme, a key theme in Psalm 27 is hope, as it is in this psalm, Psalm 25. So precisely what is missing is also most evident in this regard of Psalm 27, and that is the key theme of this person who is ashamed is the hope of forgiveness. Here's something very important. I'm glad I have this moment to pause. And that is, there are 15 words used in Psalm 25 that are taken from the golden calf incident. 15 different words. Here's some examples. In verses 4, the Hodi'eni, verse 7, Rachamecha, Chatati Ufashai in verse 7. And that is woven into this psalm, but most, if you will, subtly, is this echo of God's forgiving the Israelites for having engaged in the infidelity with the golden calf. And the message is, I am ashamed of now the Psalter, my deeds. But just as you forgave my people in the past, that history of you being a forgiving God, El Chanun V'Rachum, you are a God of mercy. That's part of that golden calf story. So that gives me hope. Back to the word hope. That gives me hope that as you forgave my ancestors, you will now forgive me in this moment going forward in my life. And as you, God, continue to guide them in the desert toward the promised land, may you reclaim that role in my life as God, as guide and teacher. Because that verses 5 to 9, there's synonyms used for God as guide and teacher, and the humility of the Psalter looking to be led by God and be taught by God as part of this process of forgiveness. So that's another powerful dimension, unspoken, not explicit, but this echo of repeated words from chapters 32 to 34 of Exodus. Any other things that might have impressed you or touched you in this psalm? Joshua Moss.
Doesn't the choice of the acrostic as an art form tell us that the author and the audience were both literate? And isn't that surprising?
It is quite remarkable. So Josh says that, the Aleph to Tuf, the A to Z, indicates that the audience had a sense of the alphabet. In Hebrew, there's 22 letters to the alphabet. And it does indicate that there was a quality of literacy. And that's right. The Psalms that are often used, particularly in high holiday liturgy, and that's not just Psalms, but often the poems written in the early Middle Ages were acrostics, precisely because of the anticipation that the audience was literate and would be able to remember the poem precisely like, I know what the next verse begins with. I know the next verse is a lamed and the verse after that is a mem. So yes, there is that quality of living remarkably, because so long ago, in what seems to be a literate community. There, as I noted up front, there will be 9 psalms constructed in this acrostic fashion, and most of them will have a missing letter or two, often with a story that we can only guess as to what is the message contained in the absence. Closing question or comment on Psalm 25? Alex.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that verses 13 and 14
Yeah.
anticipate the concluding verse 22, and that they're referring to a community. They're referring to a community of believers.
That's
of the Uriah Hashem.
Yes. Now, here's where I led to a little confusion, though. This is my problem with translation, and I'm glad you focused on that, Alex, with your sensitive reading. And that is, I put in brackets the there, the plural, and I did so because it's he. The pronoun in the Hebrew is his soul in goodness shall abide, and his seed shall inherit land. So I made it plural so as to avoid the gender. But you're But, that's the problem of being, if you will, gender sensitive is, these days, a lot of young people, in terms of choosing your pronoun, choose the plural so as not to be a he or a she. They can be a they. And that's what I did here, but your point's well taken. It did create a little confusion in terms of how verse 22 is distinctly in the plural about Israel, where everything else here, both as to himself and even as to his, and the righteous, because this is in the third person, this verse that you point to, verse 13, his soul and goodness shall abide and his seed shall inherit. I like in verse 14 the word sod, secret, in the very beginning, the secret of Adonai. And here I translate Lire'av. Often yira is fearful, those who fear God. But in Hebrew and in English, awe is often a substitute for fear. We interestingly in English have the word awful and awesome as both being awe. So that awe can have, as we know in our own life, the most extreme experiences negatively and positively can often be the most memorable and even illuminating. And so many, like Rabbi Heschel, often use the word awe instead of fear. And so here in my translation, I use awestruck for those, instead of saying those who are the fearful, to emphasize that dynamic. Well, there's a lot more to all of these. A little heads up for tomorrow. Psalm 26. It is dramatically different than Psalm 25. The Psalter tomorrow, Psalm 26, will say of himself, I have not sat with deceitful people, nor with hucksters will I go. I hate the gathering of evildoers, and with the wicked I will not sit. In fact, I've entitled it, Judge Me as a Banner of Integrity. So tomorrow's Psalter is saying to God, what others, Robert Alter, called a profession of innocence. So in contrast to the ashamed today, tomorrow the Psalter will say, look at me, God, I am that person you would want me to be. They're not necessarily linked. So I do look forward to sharing Psalm 26 tomorrow, a remarkable contrast. Is there anybody who is choosing, would like to say Kaddish today? All right, with that.
Yes, please. Yes, Rabbi.
Okay, then the opportunity to answer Amen and
I will
conclude.
too.
You know, I should, because my dad's, I missed it. Okay.
All right, so we conclude with Kaddish and the opportunity by answering Amen to do a mitzvah. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
Yalma Dibra Kirite, Yalma B'chayechon Yomeichon, B'chayechon Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala U'yizlan Kari,
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah, Shalom, Omei Olayah.
Yitbarach, 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 Yitnaseh, V'yitadar, V'yithaleh, V'yithalal, Shemei Dekrisha, Berechu, Le'elah, Kol Birkata, V'shirata, Tushbachata, V'nechamata, Damiran, Yalma, Amen.
Yeshua Rabba Min Shemaya. V'chaim Aleinu V'chol Israel. V'yuan Amen. Oseh Shalom B'ma'av. V'yaseh Shalom. Aleinu V'chol Israel. V'mru. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks to each of you for adding your presence to my day. Blessings for a good day for all.